You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today on For Your Consideration, we are covering Andrei Platonov's Chevengur, just parts 1 through 25, because this is a pretty thick book. So we're cutting our usual For Your Consideration coverage into not just a half, but actually a fourth. But it's worth the extra time, and I can tell you right now, it will not be enough. And before we move on to the episode itself, I also wanted to extend an apology. I know this is about a week late. Not that I keep to a strict schedule anymore, but I would have liked to have gotten it out on the previous Friday. But every month I say I'm going to get taken out of the tumble dryer, and then I never do. I never escape. Last week I ended up dealing with the homecoming for the university all through the weekend into the weekend. And as I record this, it is a little after 1 a.m., and I have about an hour and 40 minutes before a taxi shows up to take me and my wife to the airport to go to Matt's wedding. So we're going to see how much we can do. We're going to see how much of almost 5 years of doing this podcast has done for my time management skills in recording these things. And in this episode, we've been dealing previously with the question of the value of art in wartime. But I wanted to also explore other things. I've gotten some emails with one particular suggestion that we can, as I've been looking further and wider and things to cover and what to talk about, a suggestion that of going back to the roots, not merely because this podcast is about that, although it is, but also as a place to look for guidance, for suggestions, for thought from people who've been through difficult times, I'm going to say very lightly, before, which I thought was a pretty good suggestion and probably something that's a bit lighter than the kind of tailspin of emotions that these episodes have been recently. So that led me to Chevengur, because the obvious thought in my mind after that was, well, let's talk about the early Soviet period, a thought that not too many people have in regards to literature, but that's why we do the podcast. And as I was reading Chevengur last week, I was on Twitter, which is a bad habit of mine and I can't escape it. And if you are on Twitter, then you know that it's very hard to escape the rising tide of people who are increasingly okay with saying, fascistic things. I can't tell you how much time I spend every week just muting accounts which are posting all sorts of things, which are, hit all the isms, all the ists. And one of those things I ran across in the increasing my ever losing battle to get extremist content off my timeline was a picture of someone, I presume a selfie of the poster, holding a firearm with the phrase on it, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." Now, you may be familiar with that. It is, of course, a loose paraphrasing of Antonio Gramsci's, a line from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks written in the 30s. This one was done by Slavoj Žižek. It's a little punchier than the original one. But the reason why I bring it up is because the question as I approach this, the question I have on my mind a lot is the questions that Grossman asked about his own era, and specifically about if there were to be a trial, the trial of history, what would be the defense Grossman or any other member of Grossman's age, what would be the defense that they gave for their own age? And Grossman suggests in I think it's the Sistine Madonna, that the only defense really, it could be the hell of Treblinka, but either way, that the only defense is that they did not let what is human in man die. Not much of a defense. It is the last bastion that humanity has, holding in a sense of that senseless kindness that we've talked so much about in regards to life and fate. That is the only thing that they kept alive, and that is the only defense of the age. And as I've just mentioned previously, I've often wondered what will be the defense of our own age, if indeed we can even articulate one. To say we preserved what is human in man seems a little, well, it seems premature at this point. Maybe more relevant is Mussolini's question, again here rephrased by Zizek. Gramsci obviously is writing this, as suggested by the name of the prison notebooks, in prison after being charged, sentenced under Mussolini's rule in Italy in the 30s, a time of great evil, one which I think is cyclical in its application, probably cyclical, consistently cyclical, because the world is always dying and the world is always being born in its own ways. But it doesn't make it any less relevant or any less pertinent. Now is the time of monsters. It is always the time of monsters trying to take advantage of these ages as they pass. In some eras, more bloody than others, admittedly. But it does pose the question of who are the monsters and what will they do with that? And that is a question pretty central to Chevengur. Maybe not who are the monsters, but certainly who has power and what will they do with that is as far as I'm reading, a central question for me as I'm reading, as I'm going through this. And we'll explore that a little bit more. But before we get into it, let's talk more about who Andrei Platonov is. We previously covered Platonov, I want to say back in 2021, talking about a couple of his short stories. And we did some light coverage of him then. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about him in a little bit more detail, at least up until the writing of Chevengur in 1927 and 1928. So Andrei Platonov, and I'm taking a lot of this information. Some of it I'm adapting from Matt's old some speech on Platonov, and some of this I'm adapting from the introduction or the first chapter from the book A Companion to Andrei Platonov's The Foundation Pit by Thomas Seyfried. So the one thing we should note about Platonov is, compared to some other authors we talk about, we don't have as much insight into his personal life. Platonov was an engineer as well as a writer. In fact, in many times in his life, he was much more of an engineer than he was a writer. And so he did keep technical notebooks, which don't have tons of references to his own life. He does not, as far as we can tell, appear to have kept a diary, or if he did, we don't have access to it, or at least the sources I read did not have access to it at the time they were written. And there's not a ton we've learned from surviving letters. So we are kind of talk about kind of the bird's eye view of his life with really only a few glimpses inside the particulars. Platonov was born in 1899, Andrew Platonovich Klementov, in a suburb of the city of Voronezh, which is in the southwest of Russia. From Voronezh, as the crow flies, it's just a few hours by car to the Ukrainian border. Platonov's father worked on a railway. If you listen to our old episode on Platonov, you're going to see trains come up a lot. They will come up a lot in Chevengur as well. Platonov would also work for a railway in his late teens, and we'll talk more about his work history in a second. He goes from Andrei Platonovich Klementov to Andrei Platonov in 1920. Seyfried suggests that was an attempt either to honor his father, Platon, obviously, or he was attempting to draw a connection to Plato, whose name in Russian is Platon. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Quite serendipitous if you had that opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, or one name change. So Platonov starts writing poetry relatively young, as a preteen, in which his first poetry will be published when he's about 23 in 1922. We'll talk more about that later, but he more relevantly for this story, he started working fairly early. He was one of 11 children, started working at 14 in insurance offices, at a foundry, at a railway, like we've mentioned. You can see the influence of the railway on his life. In 1918, he enrolled in Voronezh University, studying physics and math, later switching to history, and within the same year, transferring to the electrotechnical department of the Voronezh Railway's Polytechnical Institute, where he later graduated in 1921. Now, we're gonna stick around the 1920s for a second here, because this is a very eventful time. If you're familiar with history, which I hope you are listening to this podcast, you're familiar with the October Revolution. So around this period, we are also experiencing a civil war, as another era where the old world was dying and the new one was struggling to be born. So war is happening. After the revolution in 1917, war happens around it. The whites take the city in fall of 1919. The Reds later take it back in the same year. And so Platonov was fairly close to the war, although his exact involvement is not really clear. I'm going to read a quote from Seyfried here. On a questionnaire he filled out in 1923, he stated that he did not serve in the Red Army, but claimed in an autobiographical sketch he wrote in 1942, during another war, that he had been mobilized in 1919. Most likely, as an employee of the railroad, he was automatically absorbed within the war effort. Around the same time, sometime between 1920 to 21, Platonov joins the Bolshevik Party, but leaves for reasons that are not entirely clear. Later attempts to rejoin the party are unsuccessful. So I should note here that Platonov comes in, again, with limited knowledge of his own thoughts, seeming to be a believer in the change in the Bolsheviks and what's to come. And that reflects in his books, especially with the way he criticizes, because it's hard to get better criticisms than from a true believer. That's why I've liked Grossman's work, although certainly true believer does not apply that far into his career, but the fact of having that experience earlier in his life, I think, does make his criticisms more pointed in later life. But also around the same time, in 1920, Maria Alexandrovna Kashintseeva gives birth to his son, his only son, first child, Platon. He is continuing to write. He publishes his first collection of poems in 1922. 2 years earlier, he starts working as a journalist, writing what seems to be a mixture of actual journalism and opinion pieces, and begins to grow on the Voronezh literary scene. His writings as a journalist for the newspaper, Seyfried, argues that they are not particularly coherent, but do represent a genuine hope that the Bolsheviki would reform society in existence in general in a way that actually changes people. We would know that maybe in this kind of reductive phrase I like to use, the Homo Sovieticus, right? The new man who is changed and made better by Soviet society. Now, this is something that Platonov thought a lot about and in detail, and had been believing that it was something kind of natural, and that the key was to find the connections here that would make it work. I'm going to quote from Seyfried again. For his part, however, Platonov seems to have been concerned not with the opposition to the Bolsheviks, but with finding some kind of link, some native bond between weeds, the beggar woman, the field sun, and electricity, locomotives, and the whistle which shakes the earth. In a sense, the two scenic parts of the foundation pit, maybe we'll cover that one day, the digging of the pit in order to erect the proletarian home and the collectivization of agriculture in a nearby village, preserve both this duality and the attempt to find unifying themes within it. At the same time that he's doing this work, I think this is around 1924, he also starts working as a land reclamation engineer after having graduated. And so he is responsible for introducing electricity into agriculture in areas around Voronezh, apparently planning a hydroelectric installation on the Don River, and seems to view this as his primary undertaking, such that he eventually leaves journalism altogether to focus on this job. Again, quoting from Seyfried here, once he finishes this work, he gets essentially a certificate marking all the work he had done, and it records that he had excavated 763 ponds, dug 331 wells, drained 7,600 desiatins, which is a desiatin is a unit of measurement. It's a little more than a hectare, a little less than 11,000 square meters, which if you're having a tough time visualizing it, that's about the size of a little more than 2 American football fields. He drained that 7,600 desiatins of land, irrigated 30, built bridges and dams, and installed 3 electrical stations. He would have been in his mid to late 20s doing that, so if you ever feel like you haven't accomplished enough, just think you haven't dug 763 ponds yet, but if you do, you might feel better about things. Now, although he is not continuing to work as a journalist, he does continue writing through the 20s. Some works reflected by his practical work, his work as an engineer, kind of in the same way that Grossman does with Stepan Kolchugin and Glukov, but he also writes sci-fi. Even this earlier work, Seyfried characterizes as being somewhat ambivalent about things, despite being a believer in it. I can relate to that, being ambivalent even about the things you believe in. In 1926, he moves to Moscow after he's elected the Central Committee of the Union of Agricultural and Forestry Work, which only lasts about a month before he's ejected for reasons which are not entirely clear, but that leads him into a long journey trying to find ways to support his family, who are later move in with I think with his wife's sister and his brother-in-law. So he takes on other jobs, but at the same time, his writing also starts to appear again in 1927, which is also the same year that he starts writing Chevengur. There's a kind of a through line of the ironic loyalty to the Soviet system, which is no less loyal. However, it is much less appreciated. So that does put a damper on his publishing career. Now, around this era, 1927, 1928, that's when he writes Chevengur and attempts to get it published, which does not go well for him. At this point in time, he's not arrested. The novel is not disappeared, but it is not published. It's never... bits and pieces, individual chapters are published, often edited, but the full text is not published in the USSR, at least, until 1988. Which comes about 30 years after Platonov's death. Platonov sent his work to Maxim Gorky, sort of the godfather of literature in the U.S.-Soviet Union at this time, and Gorky essentially tells Platonov that it's a good piece of work, but its portrayal of the revolutionaries, Chevengur, it's not that good. Not that it's not well done, but it doesn't reflect very well on the Bolsheviks that these are their representatives in the book. So in the face of that, he is sort of denounced by other people. He self-criticizes and says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it again, and finds odd jobs to keep funding his life, funding his family's life. I'm not going to talk too much about what goes on after this point because I don't want this to be just a recap of his entire life, but something that'll help inform what we're reading right here, right now. But I will note that, again, these are things that happened after, so it doesn't affect the writing quite as much. But his son, Platon, was arrested in 1938 on charges of attempting to blow up the Kremlin. Almost certainly a false accusation, and he's sent to a labor camp. Now, he is released 3 years later in 1941, but by then he had contracted tuberculosis, which he dies from in 1943. And during World War II, Platonov, does take care of his son until his death, but he also works as a frontline correspondent, and even with the help of Mikhail Sholokhov, publishes some adaptations of folktales for children, but he is not able to be a steady writer. This is not able to be his full-time gig, at this point. And he probably from treating his son, he also gets tuberculosis and then dies several years down the line on January 5th, 1951. Kind of an ignoble end to a great writer, although he did not produce a gigantic body of work, at least partially, probably because he was working on many other practical projects. And Chevengur is, strictly speaking, the only novel we have from Platonov. Of course, we also have The Foundation Pit, Soul, other works, but this is kind of the only one that fits that niche as a novel, a traditional novel as we understand it per se, but that's kind of splitting hairs, which we don't really need to get into right now. Now, Chevengur refers to a town, a fictional town, which the main characters who are Bolsheviks come to create real communism. However, in the first half we are covering, we don't even get to Chevengur. In fact, if you read the literature about this novel, and there is a fair bit of it, they will commonly divide the novel into part 1 and part 2. I have probably stopped reading a little bit before you would traditionally delineate part 1 from part 2 and the actual arrival of Chevengur. Kind of like the Grossman method of calling your first book Stalingrad, not really bringing one of your main characters to Stalingrad until the final pages. But even though I think the meat and potatoes of this book is going to be in the second half, the first half is doing the setup for what's coming. So we have a fair bit to talk about, but we aren't really going to be able to complete a lot of these thoughts until our next episode. The first half is also a little bit, from what I've gathered, a little less confusing is not the right word. It's not quite as experimental as the second half. It's traditionally, the first half is pretty commonly described as a somewhat picaresque series of events. Picaresque being a style of storytelling where you have this sort of not always like a kind of a trickster character, not necessarily literally one, but someone who's crafty, maybe not a goody two shoes typically, who is going from a series of event to event around a country, typically exposing some of the ridiculousness of that country. It comes from an old Spanish, I don't even know if it's a novel, I guess a story series called Lazarillo de Tormes. I think I'm getting that right. Maybe it's de Tormes. I read parts of that years and years ago when I was living in Spain, which was, as I recall, pretty funny. So cautiously, I recommend it. You might pick it up and find something in it that I do not remember. In that case, I don't recommend it, but I recall it being a pretty funny one. It'll also set you up for understanding and seeing what people mean when they say picaresque. That one's a pretty clear form of this young, I think he's an young orphan boy, kind of traveling around the countryside, trying to get something to eat and variously, interacting with, engaging with, stealing from people he meets, very much like Tom Sawyer. But in this first half, a quick recap in this first half of the book, primarily we follow this character, Alexander Dvanov, Sasha Dvanov. However, we do not really spend a lot of time with him for about 80 pages. We spend most of our time with a man named Zakhar Pavlovich. Now, Zakhar lives in a village which about every 5 years ago, the wheat, the grains, the crops, they just don't grow. And that leads to a cycle of famine. People begin to leave the town looking for work, going out into the forest to forage, simply laying down and dying. As we enter these years of famine in the start of the book, it's not a pretty time to be alive. And in fact, we have a great many people who are the best way I can describe it without going too into detail is if you've ever seen an Ilya Repin painting about this time period, about great masses of people doing dangerous tasks, possibly, and this is not easy to read in the paintings, but this is what you see in the book, kind of apathetic towards living or dying. In fact, the very first two characters we meet are Zakhar and another man who he kind of lives with, who just basically accepts that he's dying and lays down and does it right there. Mothers are killing their children. Now, Zakhar is a pretty handy guy. He spends even these years of famine working on wood, just finding things to do. He's a worker through and through. It's what he's always done, and it's what he keeps doing. And he leaves town eventually to go find work elsewhere working on a railway. Inside town, there is a fisherman who has this strange curiosity with death, and in his attempts to investigate it, ties himself to the bottom of his boat to see what's down there underneath the waves, to see what the fish are doing, because the fish understand death, of course, and in the process of doing so, drowns, leaving behind his son, Sasha, who's now an orphan, his mother having died long before that, who's then adopted by another family, who keep him around for several years until their older son, who is pushing the rest of them, saying, "Hey, we're in this famine where I'm having to go out. He and I are having to go out to beg. There's too many mouths to feed in the house," and kind of takes command over his parents and ejects Sasha from the house, in which he then goes to a nearby town to beg, as the eldest son Proskha does himself. No one's really above anyone else in this. While Zakhar is working on the railway, he runs into Proskha, who is begging, and for a small fee of about a ruble, Proskha tells Zakhar where to find Sasha. And Zakhar, at that point, who is sort of remarried, it's mentioned at some point in the past that he was married and presumably that wife died, then goes and finds Sasha and spends the next couple of years basically raising the boy as his own when he is a teenager. In these ensuing years, Zakhar just kind of falls out of life. The old ways, the excitement of learning and working with machines falls away, and the old world struggles to die. which leads to revolution, war, political parties. Zakhar eventually takes Sasha to a big town hall where you have all the different political parties just sitting there saying, hey, you should join us. And after going through everyone and not being terribly impressed, takes Sasha to the Bolsheviks table and says, all right, sign him up. This leads Sasha into a series of events where he's drafted on the way there, ends up having to take control of a train because the train conductor has disappeared. Crashes the train, although that's not really his fault. He's just the one driving it when it does crash, when another train is coming down the same line, flees back home, and is then deployed to see the countryside by Shumilin to find, basically, we're spending so much time in the city. How do we know the peasants haven't already built communism out there? Because, of course, it comes naturally to everyone. Now that they're not under the yoke of the Tsar, they must be doing it naturally, right? Well, we can't know until we send you out there. And this sends Sasha, now old enough that he has gone from Sasha to Alexander Dvanov, typically referred to as Dvanov, into this sort of picaresque series of events where he goes from town to town, runs into various situations, sometimes friendly, sometimes unfriendly, getting shot, meeting up with a young woman from the city where he was raised under Zakhar's care, and who greeted him after a period of convalescence after he caught tuberculosis. During this journey, after being taken captive by some anarchists, he's rescued by a red officer, Kopyankin, who then, he takes him back to where he's staying. Dvanov meets Sonia, this girl, young woman we mentioned before, who's now being deployed by the Bolsheviks as a teacher, and basically leaves her behind, and he and Kopyankin go and undertake the duty that Dvanov is charged with, to go find how the peasants are implementing socialism and if they're doing it well enough, which leads him into this series of odd events before he comes back to the city, at which point he is going to be, as we can understand, redeployed to Chevengur, although we will not be talking about that specifically today. So that's basically what we have so far in the story. And there's 4 major topics I want to talk about. We'll have some other sides, and that is time, technology, fathers and sons, and what is communism. That's going to be a really important one, really vital, and you're going to see why, in the same way why I think Vasily Grossman was really off his rocker for thinking he was ever going to get Life and Fate published when he wrote it, even though that Chevengur was attempted to publish it in 1928, certainly a very different time from the late 1940s. Still, you can kind of see why the Soviets were not super big on this novel. Before we actually get into those topics, I also want to mention that Platonov, every time I read Platonov, I am continually struck by his mastery over language, over describing environments. When you start this book and read about this dying village before Zakhar leaves, I mean, the desperation is jumping off the page, and maybe desperation is the wrong word. It's apathy at this point. People are laying down and simply dying for lack of food, for lack of will to do anything else. And it sets up the world that is dying and the world to be changed. Although these characters can't really conceive of it, which is where we come to our first point about time. When you read the literature, you're going to see quite a few talking about time in regards to this novel. A lot of it is going to come at the back end, where time gets a little less clear and a little less straightforward than it is in the beginning of the novel. But I'm gonna pull a line here out of this article: "Time out of line. Sequence and plot in Platonov's Chevengur" by Hallie A. White. And White writes, "Many characters, both major and minor, find it difficult to perceive or imagine time. For one reason or another, they cannot integrate memory of the past, experience of the present, and expectation of the future into a coherent flow. In this way, the themes of the first half help to prepare for the structural transformations of the second." Now, that may seem like a weird point to start off on, but it is really essential for understanding where these characters are coming from, right? And this is not a literal, like, someone cannot even conceive of the future or the past. It's simply not being able to conceive of yourself in a timeline, moving forward, right? Expecting the future, expecting a future which is in any way different from the present that you are currently living. We see that in the village at the very open, who just understand that they are in these cycles of famine, right? Well, the historical memory suggests the movement of time. These characters just accept it, right? Every couple of years, there's going to be a time of hardship. There's going to be famine. We're going to die en masse. Our people are going to leave. Who knows if they're going to come back? Mothers are going to start killing their children. And then eventually we return to the years of wheat. We move on. It happens again some years down the line. This is life. This is history. And while the Bolsheviks in this story are not consciously setting out to end this cyclical history, right? To move history forward, they in their own ways are looking for the end of history, the Marxist end of history in this context. But it is you get a sense of the drive of the people here, because as we'll talk about later, we're not dealing with characters who are particularly well educated, right? In a lot of other novels of these types, we deal with people who are probably overeducated, who are maybe a little too smart for their own good. In this case, they're not overeducated. They're not educated at all for the most part, which brings them closer to a lot of these questions, because they are not thinking of the necessarily coherently and consciously of the philosophy of their lives, but they are living it. I don't think I wrote this down. I wish I had, but we spend so much time with Zakhar Pavlovich, and we start with him as this craftsman, as someone who can build basically anything. And when he leaves and goes to the rail yard, seeing the train, although he doesn't really understand it, gives him this sense of joy and wonder in machines. And we have a foreman there who understands that in the same way. And he laments that people don't have respect for trains like they once did. But there are still people who clearly belong to that class of the foreman, Zakhar Pavlovich, even though he doesn't himself necessarily start with that, even though he does not. Pavlovich is still, the same kind as the foreman, right? The people the foreman is imagining are not existing, possibly is coming from just people who don't appreciate it in the same way he does. But Zakhar Pavlovich does, right? He learns, even before we shift away from his perspective, begins to speak to the trains, right? And he does which is not his job, but he does start to do sort of maintenance, because he feels the train telling him to loosen this nut here, to replace this part there, which he has to do in secret because no one else likes seeing this. At this point, he's still his main job is cleaning. You don't necessarily want to see your maintenance person changing out the gear shift in your car. Maybe they can do it perfectly well, or maybe they have no idea what they're doing, no more than me, right? And at this point in time, we are firmly in the time of the Tsar. People cannot imagine anything different, but there are escapes, right? This train we've been talking about for Zakhar. There's this line from chapter 6. The warm mist of love for machines in which Zakhar Pavlovich had lived peacefully and securely had been scattered by a clean wind. We're pretty firmly in the time of the Tsars, which is not to say that it is a time of complete stagnation, but it is a time when people cannot imagine something different happening. And they don't. Zakhar does not think about a different society. He thinks about what's in front of him, the things he can create, the training he can learn, right? And that is a reflection of his experience with the world, one which is meant to be bent to humanity's whims. You may not agree with that, but that's kind of where he's coming from. He's not like other peasants in the village that he comes from who think, well, surely we've invented everything there is to invent. No, as long as there's land, as long as there are materials to be molded, there's somebody to be created for Zakhar. At the very beginning, the warden went on calmly watching and smoking as Zakhar is working on the train. From frequent attendance at services, he had lost his faith in God, but he knew for sure that Zakhar Pavlovich wouldn't get anywhere. People had been living in the world for a long time, and they had already thought everything up. Zakhar Pavlovich, however, saw things differently. There were still a great many things to be thought up, since there was still natural substance living untouched by human hand. So even as we're kind of stuck in this time, as people cannot imagine something different, broadly speaking, we do have characters who see a possibility of something different. Now, this doesn't actually change anything as we get further in Zakhar's story. Despite all his work, despite all the things he's seen created, he comes to understand that the mere fact of building machines doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't change the ways they live, despite the love he has for this technology. We go from early on Zakhar thinking of trains in this almost mythic sense. The locomotive's front wheels, its pony truck, made Zakhar Pavlovich start to worry about the infinity of space. He went out at night just to look at the stars. Was there space in the world? Was there room enough in it for wheels to live and turn eternally? The stars shone with enthusiasm, but each one was alone. As he's building this technology, he questions, is the world big enough for everything we can build? But no matter what, this doesn't actually change history. They're maintaining things that simply are, that work. And as by the time we get to the rise of the Bolsheviks in this novel, things are different. He does not feel that same way. He does not feel that same connection because no matter how much love he has for machines, it's just a machine. It's neutral. No matter what you build, it doesn't have an inherent goodness or badness in it. It is what you make it to do. And he realizes that he will never travel on these trains, quote, and so Zakhar Pavlovich began to live with resignation, no longer counting on universal radical improvement. However many engines were made, neither Sasha nor Proskha nor he himself would ever be sitting in the carriages they pulled. Locomotives labored only for other people or for soldiers. But then soldiers are transported against their wishes. Steam engines are meat creatures with no will of their own. Zakhar Pavlovich now felt more pity for them than love. And sometimes in the depot, he would talk to the locomotives face to face. So we have this acknowledgement early in the novel that no matter how much you are building these things, like I said, they themselves are neutral. They don't actually change the world around them. Although you may change your interaction with the world, people like him are still out. They're not traveling on the trains, right? They can't afford to. That's not really for them. And maybe for other people in the world, time is shifting. Time is moving forward. But we aren't sitting with those people for whom the world is moving forward. This novel is not sitting in the tales of electrification, of where literacy has already been spread wide. It's sitting with the people whose lives have not changed a great deal in this time. Even Ivanov, right? His son, who is fairly well read, he is, by the standards of this time, pretty well educated. He does take night classes. He reads vociferously by himself. But even he is kind of stuck in this time period, not being able to imagine something else. There's a point when he sees, when he's first with the Bolshevik, the Red Forces, and he sees his commander reading a book and having fallen asleep, and he looks over at the page and he finds this, quote, his book was open at a page about Raphael. Ivanov had a quick look. Raphael was called the living god of the early and happy humanity born on the warm shores of the Mediterranean. But Ivanov could not imagine such a time. Then, too, the wind must have been flowing, and peasants would have been plowing in the heat, and little children would have had mothers who had died. They can't imagine anything else this time period. It is now. It must have always been, right? This difficult life had to have always been difficult. It could not have been better at one point, right? It could not be, because if it was better then, could it be better again now? And there's not a lot of hope for that. Not even these early days of the Bolsheviks. He barely understands who he's signed up for. He can say the phrases and the words, and when he moves into this phrase where he's kind of moving from village to village, he is telling everyone about what communism is. But the irony is, as educated as he is, it's clear that it's more of a technical education. He's kind of making it up as he goes. In one village, he tells people that, once we win this war, there will be no more requisitions, so you should go ahead and put your grain down in the field anyway, because you don't have to worry about us taking it all. Then he goes to a village, or this is a few chapters later, and someone says, have you heard there are no more requisitions? And you think, what fool told him that? And this guy turns out to have heard it from someone who passed through town, possibly the same person Sasha Ivanov had talked to before. Now, that's supposition on my part, but right, you see as he is going from town to town, explaining to people and running into all kinds of situations that of what communism is, it changes, it shifts. But that is when we're getting to the point when time starts to move, right? We go from this early phase, like I've been explaining for probably way too long, where no one can imagine anything different. This is life as it is. This is life as it must be. And Ivanov gets dropped into a new world where he realizes, no, that is not how it has to be. In fact, we are building our own new world. So things have to change. And we can't run away from these things that we've been talking about. The trains, the power of molding the world. And for Ivanov, raised by Zakhar, that becomes a major element in what communism is. And we'll talk more about how he and other characters conceive of communism in this book. But part of what communism is for Ivanov is, in a way, defeating nature, defeating this sense of this is how things have to be. People build villages, build cities near water sources because obviously you need water. So if you go to a dry steppe, no point in building a town there. Well, hell no. Why let things be that way? We have irrigation. We can build plumbing, piping. Yeah, that's great land up there for growing. We can build the water. We can bring the water there. You just have to settle. Things can be different. So we're seeing this time, this ability to move forward in time, conceive of time as something, a future that can be changed, that can be affected, not one that merely arrives either way. That's being set up throughout this part, and it will be more relevant next time. Moving on from there, let's talk very, very briefly about technology. I actually ended up overlapping most of what I had to say into the time section, so that's why that one was a little scattered. But right, the technology, I think I don't want to reduce it down to just one thing. It plays a lot of different roles. There are so many great passages in this book of people just describing trains, frankly, in their own ways and their own relationships to trains, which is great. I love it. But it is getting at, in my mind, one of the things that the technology or Platonov playing with technology and what does it mean in this book is kind of the question of what power does it have over us, or what power does us exerting our power over it look like? Not just what does it look like, but can it make us better? And it seems like the novel kind of comes to, at this point too, it just is what it is, right? Early on, we have Zakhar when he's reflecting on his relationship to creation. He's actually thinking, this is at one point when he's helping to put together some kind of automated musical thing for a local clergyman, and keeps going back to kind of keep tinkering with it to see what attracts people with it. Because, quote, what he wanted to know, had this artifact been constructed, an artifact that could touch any heart and make a man better and kinder. Now, that is the question of this book, really, in a way. How do you make a man better and kinder? What can you make a man better and kinder? And one way, of course, is technology. And like I already kind of said before, I'll just restate here briefly, there's an initial idea that this technology, the act of working on it, the act of creation, raises you up. But over time, Zakhar, and especially towards the later years of his life, as he thinks about all the things he's created, he gets the sense that he has done nothing. Despite everything he's created, he hasn't really affected the world around him. He's molded small bits of it to fit an image he wants, yes, but made things different, no. What is the world that Sasha Alexander now is coming up into? What is the world he is inheriting? And Zakhar really has very little to think about that, very little to be proud of for Sasha. And so maybe we'll explore this more later, but technology itself, despite the obsession with it, you'll see in other places, there is this very characteristic Platonov ambivalence towards it. Now, an ambivalence because there's an obvious love and understanding for it, but also a knowledge that the mere fact of having it isn't enough. There has to be something else. Despite the fact that these characters, as you mentioned before, seem to live in a world where things that for them are static. Their lives, while they do change over the course of their life, from they to their children to the next generation, don't foresee a future any different than the one they've lived. one of okay years, years of famine, years of death, years of migration to go find work, and maybe years of returning, God willing. But to me, also, there's an interesting sense that these children are different. Maybe it's no different because than they themselves, because we never see these characters who are already grown in this period of famine. We don't see what they're like as children, so maybe they're very much the same. But without that context, it does strike me that they seem different, which is why I've called this section "Fathers and Sons," which is not an accurate translation of Turgenev's "Fathers and Children," but women do not play a large place in this novel. They appear occasionally, very occasionally, and I'm actually going to recommend this book called "Men Without Women: Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, 1917 and 1929" by Elliot Bornstein. It has a great chapter on the sort of place or lack of place of women in this novel and others of the period. I would love to read the rest of the book. It seems really interesting. But this novel, the next generation are invariably boys. The young children we meet, with the exception of Sonia, although we don't really meet her until she's already in her late teens, somewhere between 17 and early 20s. So the next generation is really represented by the boys, by Sasha, by Proskha, by the children of some farmers that Zakhar stays with initially. And this new generation seems they don't seem particularly nice. Let me put it that way. I think the best example of this is when Zakhar first moves to the city and stays with a farmer. He's sleeping in their barn, and he, after the first night, comes out and says, "Hey, I would love to pay you. What do you want for staying here?" And the farmer basically tells him, "As long as you can, survive my kids, my sons, you got it for free." And these kids go to town on Zakhar. They pee on him. They mess with him all night, and the father is basically powerless to stop them. He says, he kind of calls them basically dumb brutes, and he doesn't know what happened to them, and says, "I've been feeding them basically half rations their whole life. I don't know how these dumb idiots got so big and stronger than me. I can't do anything to stop them." And they go out and they cause kind of terror. It's not exactly the same as Proskha, but he takes this role of leadership from his parents relatively early on. His parents, who adopt Sasha Dvanov and give him the name Dvanov, right? The mother is constantly pregnant and is consistently dealing with the children. That's kind of her main thing. I know it's a shocking portrayal of women in a novel from the 20th century. That's the main thing. But neither here nor there. She spends her time either taking care of the children, lamenting over the 7 or 8 children they've lost. The father has, by having to support this point, somewhere over a dozen children at various points, more before some of the others died, and has basically given his whole life over to apathy for only the sake of getting enough food to provide for the family, or finding ways to get it. Sending out Proskha and Sasha, the oldest boys, to go beg to bring food back. Now, Proskha kind of gets disgusted with the fact that his parents are the way they are, and the fact that they're taking care of this other orphan child, Sasha, and essentially kicks Sasha out of the house and becomes sort of a master of the realm. He is the one who browbeats his parents into doing what he thinks is right and looks at them as stupid and dull people. Right, when he goes to the city, when Proskha later has to go to the city to beg for his own family, and sees Zakhar, he doesn't simply say, "Oh, Sasha." Maybe this is too late in the episode to say this, but Zakhar kind of knows Sasha because Sasha is the son of the fisherman who drowned, as I mentioned. Zakhar kind of knew the guy, so not a real close connection. But Proskha doesn't say, "Oh, let me take you to Sasha." He says, "Give me a ruble. Give me a ruble and I'll bring him over to you." He's extracting everything he can, which, given how little they have, it doesn't exactly make sense per se, but you can kind of see where he's coming from. But you see, outside of Sasha, really kind of these not very pleasant young men who this world is bearing. And something notable I see in them is something that's also in Zachar, is that there's no attention paid towards the future, no sense that they see what's coming next. They're just trying to get from one day to the next. And that is where Sasha sets himself apart, because he, in this same period, while these other guys are just trying to survive or just trying to get a laugh, he is reading, he's learning. This brings a lot of pride to Zachar to see his sort of son read throughout the years. Now, that being said, much in the same way that technology is not a savior, neither is education either. Quote, however much he read and thought, referring to Sasha now, inside him there always remained some kind of empty space, and through this emptiness passed the unwritten and untold world like an anxious wind. At the age of 17, Sasha still had no armor over his heart, neither faith in God nor any other peace of mind. He would not give a name not its own to the nameless life opening before him, but he didn't want the world to stay unnamed. He was merely waiting to hear its proper name from its own lips, rather than other people's contrived labels. Despite all this learning, it does not naturally lead Sasha to Bolshevism. It does not naturally lead Sasha to this understanding that this is how the world must be. His father takes him to the Bolsheviks, essentially their little table in a big hall, saying, hey, come over and join us, and says, Sasha, sign up for them. That's it. This is a pretty fascinating, hero for an early communist novel, to basically be someone who's from the working class, who is a self-educated person, who kind of chooses it at random. You'd wonder if Zachar was not put off by everyone else, if he might have had him join the whites or the anarchists, right? And he does appear to read from other traditions as well. At one point later on, when Platonov is sent out to reconnoiter villages to find out about the state of communism there, he's not exactly ambushed, but set upon by some anarchists who plan to rob him. But they decide to rob him anyway, but they decide not to leave him for dead after he hears one of their names and said, oh my God, you wrote a book. I really enjoyed it, and gives a pretty an analysis of the book that impresses the author enough that they don't leave him for dead. All right, he's quite a broadly self-educated person, and yet it doesn't naturally lead him to communism, and it doesn't seem to give him a better idea of what communism is, really. And that is something that is continually interesting to me, that he does not have a great deal of political education per se, which will play a larger role in the second half as we go from this sort of analysis of the communism that's happening naturally, spontaneously from the heart of the people, of the peasants, which we find out is mostly not happening, as Platonov and Kopyankin go from one place to the next. They find places which are abandoned, which have technically representatives of the Bolsheviks, but who have had so little contact that they basically turn it into their own little fiefdom. One guy who's walking around in a suit of old armor, kind of threatening everyone around him to keep paying their tithes, essentially, and one who's insisting, oh, now we're in a communist society, so when someone comes over to borrow something, he yells at them, said, how many times do I have to tell you to stop asking for it? Just take it. Not a little bit more communal than maybe people are imagining. Another one which they are obviously beset by brigands, by anarchists, by villages who claim they are being held by the whites, but are really just saying that to scare people off. So either they will be the Reds or others and think, oh, they're under the protection of the whites, we should go, or they're the whites and think, okay, perfect, got it, we'll move on. He does not go out and find communism, is the short version. And he and Kopyankin attempt to kind of assert some sort of power, but they clearly do not understand it themselves, which will bring us to our last point for today. And I regret that this is the last point, because we've been at this for an hour, and I can tell you, I feel like I haven't even touched on a tenth of what I want to talk about for this book. Maybe one day we'll come back and do a chapter-by-chapter reading. There's only 30-something, maybe 40 in here, so it would be a lot easier than the 100-something in Life and Fate. that might actually be kind of fun because each chapter of this is so dense. So dense. It's not quite like it's not quite as dense as The Unsimple. If you remember our covering Taras Prochaska's great book. Not quite that dense, but yeah, pretty dense. Dense enough that I feel like I'm literally barely scraping the surface. I say that often, feeling like I've actually gotten a chunk out of a book, but this one literally is barely scraping the surface. If you read it, you'll be yelling at me saying, why didn't you cover any of this other stuff? Because I only have about an hour and sometimes up to 2 if I'm really got a lot of free time to talk about this. However, I have 33 minutes until my taxi comes, so we're going to get to the last part of this episode. It's kind of fun to be working under pressure. It's like I'm back in news again. So, final section, what is communism? And we're going to go back to that book I mentioned earlier, Men Without Women, going to apart from chapter 6 and specifically focusing on Chevengur. And it has Borenstein writes whatever kind of expressed earlier. Unlike the protagonists of, quote, more traditional novels of ideas, Platonov's Chevengurians are not educated or intelligent enough to argue with any sort of rigor. They embody theories rather than espouse them. They represent the unmediated idea let loose in an attempt to transform the world. Rather, they examine the philosophy behind the idea. Platonov displays the world that results from it. And that's where you get these very basic ideas of what communism is. Let's focus in here on Stvanov, Kopyankin, and another man named Fyodor Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky, in this case, has renamed himself, has taken on the name Fyodor Dostoevsky for the sake of remembrance, as several other people in his own town have, including one now named Christopher Columbus. So these three kind of debate their own ways on how to make this area that Fyodor Dostoevsky is overseeing communist, and they all have pretty interestingly different ideas of how to approach that. On one hand, we have, let's talk about Kopyankin, who has been criminally underserved by this episode. Kopyankin is a lot of Spanish novel. A lot of references to Spanish novels and Spanish ideas in this episode. He's a very Don Quixote-like character. He's riding around on his big horse, which is ill-suited to being a cavalry horse. It's big and broad and best suited probably for moving heavy loads. But nonetheless, he rides around on it thinking only of socialism through the realm of Rosa Luxemburg, right? The German social democrat, originally Polish, but later, most known in Germany, Marxist theorist and socialist who was murdered. Socialism is Rosa to him. Socialism is Luxemburg going to her grave. One day, he and his source, the strength of the proletariat, will make it all the way to Luxemburg's grave and dig it up and show her this brand new socialist land they're building. That is what drives him. She's the reason he tilts at windmills, right? And he thinks of communism only through the lens of Bolshevik decrees. What the socialists have said, what the Bolsheviks specifically have said, is the right way to do things. He walks into town and says, "Are there enough decrees?" Right? Even you get to this point of ridiculousness when they find these 8 people in a town who are, have built their own commune, and he encourages them to all meet and says to them, right, you're meeting every other day, but to really be communist, you've got to meet every day. In fact, you have to meet twice a day to make sure you're all staying on track here. And they all vote and say, yes, we'll do that. And he says, no. You can't all vote in unison. There has to be one woman who votes against, a contrarian, right? There has to be a complication. And so they designate someone to vote against, and she votes against, and someone abstains. And they say, why are you abstaining? And he says, well, you said we should have complications. Well, let's have another one. She votes no, and I always abstain. And they say, great idea. That's what we do. Everyone in favor, and then he abstains, and the other woman votes no, and everyone else votes yes, and then he is now the abstainer. All right, it's ridiculous, but it's it is when you have someone who is focusing on building this world through decree, through the process rather than through the world itself. And like Borenstein said, right, we're seeing this taken to a ridiculous end when the process overcomes the actual what they're needing to do. And, process overcoming reality, that never happened in the Soviet Union. That's certainly not a bit prophetic in its own right. I'd say prophetic. That's probably the wrong term because it's probably something that he saw happening around him in his own life. Platonov, I mean. Then you have Dvanov, who's very much his father's son, very much the son of Zakhar, who is thinking of socialism through the lens of conquering the land, of molding it to fit your will. Socialism is when you can move a town up onto a high step because you've got pipes that bring water up there so they can grow better crops and use this land that hasn't been used before. That's socialism. That's why we got to move people from villages, which are perfectly fine, and telling them, well, if you don't do it, we're going to bring other people in to do it. So you should do it now. No particular reason to do it. A lot of these places are not well off. So, yeah, maybe they could benefit by something new. It might not do anything for them. In fact, it very likely wouldn't because it's not changing anything about the way that what brought them to this circumstance in the first place. It's just a new place. And it's not merely a, molding the earth to your whims. Dvanov is thinking somewhat ecologically, right? Like the coming of socialism, the taming of the world will also make the world itself better. It'll make the sky brighter. It'll make the lands more happy in their own right to be used. But this perspective also leads to some own ridiculousness in its own right. At one point, Kopyankin Dvanov, a forester living alone, and they go up to him and say, how much of this land are you taking care of? And he tells them, and they say, well, about how much would this wood go for? And he gives them an amount. And they say, that's pretty low. Isn't rye almost double that amount? And he says, yes, sirs. Yeah, that rye is in higher demand than this wood. You could get more money for it. They say to him, well, then clearly this is not a good use of this land. We should clear cut this forest and start growing rye here instead. And he says, well, we already have some peasants who are cutting down areas to grow their rye here. And the two of them say, great. Well, then the peasants already have the idea of communism. They're cutting down the trees to grow rye, right? Clear cutting forests. That's communism. Of course, the advent and then death of conservationism. I shouldn't pronounce conservationism dead just yet, but it's not quite what it was. Not for lack of trying, just for greater resistance from, I guess, people who hate the earth. Don't hate the earth, who really see it as an infinite resource which we can always benefit from, and there is no way in which we could ever run out of these things. But neither here nor there. Right, working together, and Kopyankin and his decrees, and Dvanov thinking very abstractly about the value of the earth and the taming of it as communism, right, leads to these kind of ridiculous demands they give to people. And they're pretty unbending in these things. But then you also have Dostoevsky, who thinks of the happiness of the people in a pretty self-interested way. At one point, we set one of his fantasies where he's giving out decrees and everything's working perfectly, and all these young women are around him, these young comrades in the party, and quote, the young maidens were falling in love with Dostoevsky, but they were one and all party members, and party discipline did not allow them to confess their love. In the line of duty and political consciousness, they suffered in silence. So Dostoevsky is a little self-interested here. Let's say that lightly. But that's not the whole the reason he's doing it. Whenever Kopyankin gives him, say, you should do this, we need to redistribute the animals we have here so we can get rid of kulaks. So Dostoevsky doesn't want to do it because, well, that's going to make people unhappy. And that's not socialism. That's not communism. Well, it is to Kopyankin. And the kind of the irony of this redistribution, this expropriation of animals they have, is that they give the horses from the rich peasants, the kulaks in this case, to the poor ones. And Dostoevsky is not entirely convinced because he, for his faults in thinking about this, does have an inaccurate understanding of what's going on. And he says to them, well, we're running into a problem here. Actually, this isn't Dostoevsky. This is another peasant, I should say, who says, well, when some of these horses are mares, and when these mares bear colts, well, wouldn't it be only fair to redistribute those colts to people who don't have horses now back to the kulaks? But if people mayors have cults and they know they're going to have to give it away, why would they take care of that cult? Why would they not just let it die? Because that's now an added burden, which they're going to have to give away. And Kopyankin says, nonsense, that's not going to happen. And Dostoevsky kind of thinks, and he tells this man named Half-Baked, if you Half-Baked, asks Kopyankin directly, what is socialism, right? You're saying all these things. You're saying that this is not true. What is socialism? And he says to Kopyankin says to him, if you were a poor peasant, you'd already know. Spontaneity. But since you are Kulak, you won't understand anything anyway. So luckily for him, he doesn't need to explain anything. It's self-apparent. If you knew, you knew. If you know, you know. But Dostoevsky is kind of on Half-Baked side with it, but he doesn't push back because, of course, Kopyankin rules by decree, and everything. You can never be uncertain in this. You have to be absolutely certain in all of your duties. Kopyankin, quote, did not understand doubt and had none himself, seeing any uncertainty of spirit as a betrayal of the revolution. Rosa Luxemburg had thought everything through in advance on behalf of everyone, and all that was required now was feats of arms to destroy enemies visible and invisible. Several times throughout this novel, Kopyankin turns to Ivanov and says, should we liquidate this little community we found? And Ivanov says, no, we should try to reorganize them. And Kopyankin is happy to do it by decree. But in this case, Dostoevsky sides with Half-Baked, and despite acquiescing to Kopyankin, does kind of make the side remark, well, it turns out the poor peasants are still going to be the ones working because now they're the ones with the horses. Well, the prosperous peasants, the former kulaks, they don't have anything to do anymore. Their work, the way they've set up their lives, has revolved around having this livestock. It's not so much the case anymore. So we have, again, this confusion over what is exactly socialism, which every member of the party we're meeting as having a different definition is creating sort of chaos among people. Chaos such they don't have to stick around for. They get to make their decrees and then leave. Right? The people who are obeying under the barrel of a gun, not literally at this point in time. Some of them are on board but uncertain. Others are simply trying to get by. And this is the fact that people are not being driven by ideology kind of comes home for Ivanov, right? By the time he finally returns. When he goes back to the city, leaving Kopyankin, he's going back to make his report and finds the city lively in a way that he doesn't remember. And he initially thinks, has this been taken over by the whites? But no, the NEP, the new economic policy, has been put in place. Capitalism has returned, and that's a weird moment. People are in the city pretty overjoyed, and it's a pretty stark differentiation from the countryside, where people are still living in poverty and barely scraping by. Where now the NEP, the bringing of goods, the transportation, access to supply networks outside of a war-torn region is now making life easier for these people. Quote, many others were striding along the streets to their sweethearts. Now that they were getting better nourished, people had begun to sense their souls. Not everyone was drawn to the stars. Many had grown tired of large ideas and infinite expanses, these things that had taken up so much of the early novel. Quote, they had learned that stars would be reduced to a handful of ration millet. Well, that kept ideals safe and sound was the typhus louse. So people are not being drawn by big ideas. They're being drawn by very practical concerns in this novel, something that Ivanov and Kopyankin have struggled to understand up to this point. Gosh, there's so much more to talk about, but I am now down to 15 minutes. So I'm going to wrap it up here for now, for the sake of making my flight. And we'll continue to talk about what these themes mean in the second half of Chevengur, from 26 to 40 something. I should have looked at exactly how many chapters are in this before I started recording, but I'm going to keep talking to you as I figure that out, and we're going to see exactly how much time that takes me. 44 chapters, 26 to 44. We're going to be covering that next time, and diving a bit more deeply into all these topics. Maybe taking some time to talk about what does this mean for us for now. What is there to learn from this? If you have any thoughts, if you want to start reading with this and you want to send any thoughts my way, you can of course send them to slaviclitpod@gmail.com, or join our Discord, or email me, cameronlalana@gmail.com. whatever one works. I always appreciate your thoughts. So that's what's coming next time. But for now, podcasting is not expensive, but it's also not free. So to help keep the show independent, you can head on over to the website slaviclitpod.com to find ways to support us. Could be monetary, could be just leaving a review somewhere. I do appreciate hearing kind words about this. But be that as it may, before I let you go, I also wanted to extend a really sincere thank you to all the people who are supporting this podcast and helping make it possible. Helping me justify to my life, stepping away for a pretty significant importance of time every week to do reading or research for this podcast or buying another book for our already overstuffed shelves. The music used in this episode was Starai Kino by Paramotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes. You'll hear from me again soon.
Hey, 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 hey.